All right, guys, we are wrapping up the last component of our SCOTUS unit. Right, so we started looking at the basic foundations of the judicial branch. And then we looked at civil liberties. We honed in or we focused on First Amendment protections, specifically freedom of religion with the free exercise in the Establishment Clause, and then the free speech clause. Right. Then we transitioned and we looked at some other liberties, specifically those that have been selectively incorporated, or ones in which the 14th Amendment has been used to embed those protections into state governments as well. We looked at Second Amendment right to bear arms. We looked at privacy, including looking at searches and seizures, right? We looked at the right to remain silent, the right to an attorney, right? Those protections for people who've been accused of committing crimes. Now, we are moving on to our discussion of civil rights in preparation for our last round of moot court, except this time we will be doing 2 Supreme Court cases and they will last much longer. Okay, so with that, again, just a quick review. Remember that civil liberties are protections from unfair or unreasonable government infringement in your life, right? The Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment is what most closely links with that. If you're struggling with that, you should probably pause the video, maybe go back and look in your notes, go back and read that section and your textbook. But, right, civil liberties is your freedom to act without unreasonable government interference in your life. It's whatever the amendment is, typically plus the 14th Amendment's Due Process Clause is what incorporates that into the states. Okay, when we look at civil liberties, they are different. They are looking at ensuring that people are not treated with unfair or unreasonable differences. Civil rights look at protecting people against discrimination, right? There are some issues that fit in both categories, right? So we looked at the Masterpiece Cake Shop case. We looked at actually, we'll just stick with Masterpiece Cake Shop. Okay, so that was a civil rights issue because we were looking at what rights were being provided to people based on their sexuality, but it was also a civil liberties issue because, right, Mr. Phillips had the liberty to make decisions that were appropriate based on his First Amendment rights. So you do need to recognize, although we need to understand the difference between a civil right and a civil liberty, the issue at hand often, right, what we're talking about might depend on the person who is being impacted by that discussion. Typically, when we talk about civil rights, we are still linking in the 14th Amendment, but we are explicitly linking in the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, right? That guarantees that all citizens should be treated equally, all right? So with that, let's get into a couple of different topics. Then you guys are going to have a worksheet, whether you do it digitally on paper, with some important civil rights related policies. And then there's a couple crash course videos that correspond with these topics. And then once we're done all of that, you guys can start prepping for your final task, which is task 3, 2 Supreme Court cases dealing with civil rights related issues. Okay, so with that, I want you to think about what is the difference between equity and equality. And I'm going to give you a political cartoon to look at here in a second. And then I'll kind of talk about a few differences. All right, so if you were looking at this cartoon, I'm sorry, my head's covering up this word justice that appears here. When we look at this, we are going to use the words equity and equality rather interchangeably within our class, but I do want you to recognize that they are different. Okay, so when we talk about equality, equality is when all people are afforded the exact same resources. And the idea is that if everybody has the exact same resources, they then have the exact same opportunities, right? So if we look at what this cartoon is depicting or displaying, and I understand that different people might have different perspectives, and that's perfectly fine, okay? Right, so if we look at this, we gave everybody 1 block. However, right, if you're really short, that 1 block doesn't work. And even though you've been given the same thing as the other 2 people next to you, you are still not afforded the same opportunity to watch the game. If we look at the middle image, this is meant to represent equity, right? And so with here, everyone is getting the support that is appropriate, right? It's the idea that everybody has different circumstances, and therefore we need to allocate the resources based on that person's circumstances, right? So with this one, we see the first person gets no block, the second person gets 1 block, and the third person gets 2 blocks, and now everybody has the same opportunity to watch the game, okay? The third one looks at justice, and this is about fixing the system, right? Rather than providing something to accommodate for problems in the system that might lead to inequity or discrimination or unfair treatment, justice looks at modifying the system, right? Switching the system so that hopefully the barriers no longer exist and we don't need to allocate or modify resources to adjust or accommodate for that, okay? All right, so with that, when we talk about civil rights here, I'm going to talk about a couple of foundational principles. I already talked about some of those with the initial slide, right? Just a couple of quick things, right? The Declaration of Independence, and you don't need to be writing this one down, says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." I want us to recognize that when this was written in 1776, when it said all men are created equal, it literally meant all men, but really it meant white men who were 21 years old and owned a property, okay? So today, all men are created equal. We understand that to be, and we try to have a system that means all humans, M-A-N, all humans are created equally and deserve equal treatment. But again, do know when those lines were written, it was white men, 21 and older, who owned property. So it was a very small sect of the population. Our interpretation of that phrase is much different now than it was when it was written, okay, over 200 years ago. More modern or recent, right, the 1860s, we see the 14th Amendment ratified to the Constitution, right? This is considered one of the civil rights amendments, following the Civil War. So the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, the 14th Amendment abolished citizenship and equal protection, and then eventually we'll get the 15th Amendment that guarantees voting rights regardless of race, okay? The Equal Protection Clause is the portion of this 14th Amendment that really roots equal rights. Again, I do want you to know that even though this amendment was added to the Constitution in the 1860s, it is not until close to the 1960s or 70s that we actually see it come to fruition, right, during our civil rights movement. Again, make sure you've read the sections dealing with civil rights and the civil rights movement in your text. But a lot of people push for change, and that's what led to change. Political participation is important. If there's something you want to change in your government, in your society, it is your job to do that, okay? So please, please, please do keep that in mind. Okay, I did talk about the Commerce Clause here. We haven't talked about this a whole lot. The Interstate Commerce Clause says that Congress has the right to regulate any types of interstate business. So this is one way that the federal government can enforce equal protections or equity in different areas of business. If a company does business in more than one state, okay, or they are providing businesses to people of multiple states, such as a hotel, for example, or a rest stop or a restaurant that's on the interstate supporting travelers, right? The federal government has the authority to then control more of what that business does if the business is interstate, right? Typically private industry, if it's small scale within one state, the state can control that. The second you cross borders, the federal government has even greater control than they would in other instances. So it's important to see how the Commerce Clause kind of skews things. Okay. All right. So with that, I don't want you to think that the way that the current interpretation of the Constitution is means that every single person has to get the exact same stuff, right? It is about equity, not always about equality. Okay, so I have this first bullet up here that says rational basis, reasonableness standard, strict scrutiny. The first two kind of go together. What I want you to realize is if there is a legitimate reason for differentiating the treatment that different groups of people get, then that is okay. But it is not okay to treat people differently without justifiable cause. The way that the court has interpreted this is that differences between men and women, and I'm talking about assigned at birth here. We're not going to get into gender-related issues, even though that is without a doubt an equity-related topic covered by Title IX, which you'll research in a little bit, okay? Typically, different treatment among genders is more acceptable because there is a legitimate physiological difference between the male body and the female body. However, different treatment among races, ethnicities, religion, those things are not considered as reasonable or rational, and therefore they follow a stricter scrutiny, right? They are much more cautious when different treatment is acceptable in regards to areas where you can't distinguish a clear difference between them, like you can between the female body and the male body. We see some of these things related to the military and police requirements for men and women are different. When we look at requirements for the military draft, men are required to register for selective service when they turn 18 years old and possibly be drafted, even though we have not done that since the Vietnam War. However, women are not required to do the same thing. We do see some all boy and all girl schools. Those are permitted. However, schools by race are not permitted. It's not acceptable. That was right. Brown versus Board of Education said, yeah, we're not segregating. Separate but equal is not really a thing. Okay. And then we do see some differences in rape and sexual assault based laws, depending on the state. Typically, right, crimes against women in some states are considered more severe than crimes against men. So important things to consider in that regard, right? Again, kind of review your textbook if you feel like you need more information on that. The last topic I'm going to talk about real quickly here is affirmative action, and then I'm going to leave the rest of this content up to you doing your reading, doing your worksheet, watching the follow-up crash course video, and then us working through our moot court simulation. Okay, but make sure you're doing the grunt work that goes with this. Okay. Affirmative action is a major policy that's faced all kinds of debate. I'm just introducing it here because the very next task that you have is to make sure that you have watched the crash course on affirmative action and taken whatever notes you feel appropriate at that point. Okay, the goal of affirmative action is to ensure that we've got diversity in the workplace, in schools, in other institutions. There's been lots of criticism of affirmative action in practice, right? It's not actually one individual policy. However, Kennedy and Johnson both used, the presidents Kennedy and Johnson both used this language in their attempt to address civil rights related concerns. Okay, lots of controversy that maybe affirmative action is reverse discrimination or it is discrimination against the majority. This court case, the Regents of California versus Bake, deals with that. Bake was not admitted to medical school, and he argued that it was because he was white and that less qualified minority candidates got in over him. And in the end, he took this all the way to the Supreme Court and he won. And the court said, you're right. In the end, they said that when considering all kinds of factors, race or ethnicity or minority status can be a factor of consideration, but it cannot be the determining fact. You cannot solely admit somebody into a college. You cannot hire somebody solely based on their minority status, okay? So again, that's just a quick little introduction. Please do make sure that you definitely watch the affirmative action crash course video. You can watch the discrimination crash course video. It is optional, but it is still suggested. It's a good watch. Make sure that you complete your worksheet on different policies related to civil rights, and then get a little introduction into our task 3. You can see what your roles are. You can see what cases that you were assigned. Do a little research. Task 3 is going to be a little bit different in that we are going to spend one entire class period on each case, but we are only going to have 2 instead of 4. All right, that is all I have for you. Please reach out with emails if you have questions, and I will see you when I return on Tuesday.